All right. Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to your last session of Android Summit. I guess, oh no, not your last one, sorry, second to last. I'm Huyen Dao, and I'm an Android developer at Trello, and I am 130% a constraint layout fangirl. I have been, I think, since 2016 when it was introduced. And you know, when you really love something and someone maybe doesn't feel the same way you do, you kind of feel a little hurt inside. This actually happened at work, and it is kind of the inspiration for this talk. And one of my teammates, who I adore working with and is one of the sharpest engineers that I know, said to me once, well, I don't think I'm using constraint layout right. And he didn't, that's not really a bad thing to say, but I also was like, what do you mean you don't think you're using it right? And I think that when I approach layout, I honestly believe that if you're not doing anything like particularly hacky or kludgy, and that it looks the way you want and behaves the way you want in all the situations that you need it to do the thing in, it's right. You know what I mean? It's just being very pragmatic about it. And I think that with constraint layout, I can kind of see though why they felt that way. I mean, if we go to, say, the constraint layout documentation and you scroll through, there's a lot, right? And I actually ended up talking to, I think, another dev about this, and they said that they found like the documentation just really hard to parse. There's just so much. And I think what happens is that it gets a little overwhelming, just the sheer volume of things in constraint layout. And even kind of day to day, when you build a layout, there's always, you know, multiple solutions to the same problem, or at least there very often is. And so taking a huge feature set and then taking, you know, the infinite, almost infinite possibilities of layout creation and putting those together, you can kind of see how it can feel overwhelming. And, you know, I can kind of see that they felt maybe not necessarily that they weren't using it right, but that maybe they weren't using it to its full potential. So that's kind of was the idea for this talk. And again, I really feel like layout should be as pragmatic as possible. You know, always use the simplest tool that meets your needs. And so what I'd like to do with y'all today is kind of build a toolbox. You know, there is a lot in constraint layout, but to be honest, day to day in my constraint layout loving life, I use like maybe a small subset of things for like 80 to 90% of like my use cases. And then sometimes I'll need something really specialized or have to do something kind of weird. But, you know, that's, I think if you have a really good base of kind of go-to ride or die tools, just get comfortable with those in constraint layout. And if you can, again, do what you need and what you want with those tools, then you're good. You're using constraint layout right. So I have, okay, it's not really a toolbox. It's, it's like a document, right? But what I'm going to do is go through an example of a layout and kind of review, again, my ride or die tools and throw them in here, you know, as we kind of talk about them. And hopefully at the end of this talk, this will be filled with, again, the things that I use 80 to 90% of the time in my constraint layout life. And I hope that, you know, it's a list that if, you know, maybe if you're already like super pro and like a guru of constraint layout, maybe it's like a good review. If you're still kind of feeling like you're not leveraging constraint layouts to its full potential, you know, maybe try some of these things if you haven't tried them before. But again, I kind of just want to create a solid base that will hopefully get you through 80 to 90% of your day and give you the comfort and familiarity with constraint layout in case you had to do something super specialized. So looking at my layout here, there's no slides, by the way, and I'm going to be typing, so I apologize. I think someone can yell at me if I'm typing. Well, I can't really help with the typing too loud, but I'll see what I can do. So let's pretend that I am building a movie app, right? And say that, you know, I have this detail screen that has some information about my movie, director name, synopsis, some posters, et cetera, et cetera. So in the toolbox, first things first, the basics. So I'm going to assume that you know something about constraint layout and hopefully you have used it before. And if you have, then hopefully, you know, these first four things seem very familiar. So constraint layout is all about relative positioning and constraining views relative to each other. So the first four, of course, are position constraints, where you can constrain the top, bottom, start, end, or left or right. But I prefer start, end to, you know, corresponding sides of other views. And then, of course, we have the very familiar dimension constraints, match parent, wrap content, you know, specific dimensions with DP, SB, PX, or dimensions. And then we have something very special called 0DP. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So I actually gave this talk before. And I made this whole big show about saying, hey, you know, in the documentation, something you should never, never use is match parent. And if you work with me and have been on and had me review your PRs with constraint layout, I'm that annoying person that's like, don't use match parent. I was told very kindly by Nicola that actually match parent is supported in Constraint Layout 2.0, and you feel free to use it. But what I want to clarify is how and what for. So I feel like sometimes, you know, in other layouts, I've used match parent as kind of, you know, especially the kind of very old school fill parent, like, you know, like just take up as much space as you can. And I know that, for example, in a linear layout, I'll just throw match parent at the bottom because I want that thing to just take up the rest of the space. Match parent in constraint layout is super, super literal. So if I look at my kind of movie detail screen here, and I look at the movie title, it is set to match parent, and it has margins, start and end margins, which is respecting. So match parent very literally says, okay, minus margins, I'm going to be the exact width or height of the parent. Now, here I have this kind of director name, and it is also set to match parent. Now, the problem is that if you look at it, and if I take, say, the margins start and end out, there we go, better example. So what's going on here is that my director name should be, or at least I'm intending it to be aligned to the start edge of my title here. And also I want it aligned also to the start edge of my year so it fits in between the two, but it's not. Because I have match parent here and no other margins that are kind of, you know, taking away some of that space, it's extending and it's actually violating, you know, these constraints. So definitely when you use match parent, it's totally fair. It works with margins, but it kind of works almost independently of, you know, positioning sort of relative to other views, or at least it will ride or die, hell or high water be match parent. What I really want here is 0DP. Now 0DP, I had it here in my toolbox that it's actually match constraint. That's like the mode, I guess, if you want to call it, the type of dimension constraint is match constraint. And, you know, if you've used linear layout a lot and you've used weights, it looks really familiar, right? And I think it's easy to think of 0DP as basically fill parent, and it acts that way, right? So basically match constraint says, all right, everything else be damned, excuse me, you're going to fit the constraints. You're going to align to the start of this movie name. You're going to align, you know, to this year, hell or high water. But within those bounds, the view is allowed to be as greedy as possible. So it starts sucking up as much space, you know, in that kind of horizontal axis as it can. And excuse me, it's kind of easy again to think of it as just fill parent. But what I really want to, you know, kind of, you know, state and like super like impress is that 0DP, you shouldn't just think of it as fill parent, but think of it as almost like an unlocking of like superpowers. I've like compared it to like Shazam, or like when the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers say it's morphin time. You can kind of think of match constraint as opening up a lot of possibilities for you in what you can do and how you can constrain that view. So as an example of this, I have this image here. The name is still, it's not a movie still, it's a poster. So to show you what kind of the cool attributes that you can unlock using match constraint, one of my favorite things is dimension ratio. So say I wanted this image to be square. In this case, I'm very, you know, I'm very literally setting it to, you know, equal width and equal height, but that's like less than ideal, right? What if something changes, or, you know, what if I change the dimensions? And I mean, it's, you know, I have to change both of them. It's very, you know, kind of brute force way of doing it. What I can do instead is something like this. Say that I wanted to keep it square. I can actually, you know, I want it to be 80 dp wide, but I want the height to always kind of match that width in a square. I can actually use constraint dimension ratio. And because I've set height to match constraint, it will look at this ratio and say, okay, so you want this to be 1-to-1. So whatever the width is, I'll match the height to, you know, match that and to make it square. And regardless of what size, you know, my image is, that ratio is maintained. And that's because the height is set to that match constraint. I'm allowed to use dimension ratio. And, you know, not just like say 1-by-1, but if I want to do something cute like this, or like this is absolutely like kind of one of my favorite attributes or tools within constraint layout. But again, there's a lot of attributes in constraint layout that I think sometimes when I first use it, I would just kind of like start throwing them in and wonder, well, why doesn't this like max width work, and why doesn't percent work? And that's because they work in conjunction with this match constraint. So again, don't just think of 0DP as like, a linear layout weight or as fill parent, but think of it as just, this opportunity to use, some of these more interesting tools. Now, let's see. If we go, let's see, where am I at? Okay. Now, something that else that is really interesting in constraint layout is just the different types of positioning that are available to you. So I have my director name here, right? And I have my year. And I very simply have aligned the top of the year to the top of the director. Now, because of the relative font sizes right now, it works okay, right? That's fine. But say that my director name had something, I don't know, really weird, like some crazy like top padding or something, say like that, doesn't quite work out, right? Things will get misaligned. Now, what I might do before constraint layout is center this year, relative to this director name, but that doesn't really work out either. What is really nice to do with text is to align on the baseline. And if you're not familiar, baseline is just a typography term concept where, most text sits on a line, some glyphs might have like little extenders like the tail of this Y that sit below it, but basically all text sits on this baseline. And when you have different, pieces of text, regardless of whether they might be disparate sizes, you generally want to line them on the baseline. And it's super, super easy to do that in constraint layout. So if I go here to my view, to my year view, and rather than aligning it to the top of the director, if I say baseline of a director here, you can see that, hey, I can actually see the baseline, if you can see that here, and you can see that here's the baseline anchor here. And it's a really nice way of keeping that year aligned to the director. And so even if I say do something really nutty, like something like this, you can see that the year follows that. And I didn't have to kind of do anything janky like center it, but then add like a hard-coded margin or anything. It is kind of like a high-level way of saying, I want you to do this, which is another reason I absolutely love it. And again, like your mileage might vary depending on what kind of app or what kind of layouts you build. But I generally very much think that baseline goes in the toolbox just because we work so much with text. And I'm sure there's probably somewhere inside of the material design guidelines that say you should align like buttons or like different pieces of text to each other like that. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. All right, and we have them nice and base aligned. So something else that is really, really handy in terms of constraint layout, and it's not really a tool, it's a concept. So hold on. Let me just go here. What is really, really neat is that constraint layout has this concept of handling impossible constraints. So what does that mean? So in this case of like this icon here, so I'm not a designer, I'm a developer. So I have this icon to show that it's a hot movie right now. And what I have is I have the icon start aligned to the start of the poster, the icon's end aligned to the end of the poster, and the top and bottom aligned to the top and bottom of the poster. So what's really interesting is that this is actually an impossible constraint, and it literally says that in documentation. That's where I got the term from. Now the reason it's impossible is because the icon is a totally different size than the poster, these constraints are never going to be 100% met, right? Like there's no way that I could simultaneously have the start of the icon stick to the start of the poster and also have the end of each, aligned. It's just impossible. But what constraint layout does is it's able to kind of recognize this and handle it. And it kind of has a very consistent, logical way of dealing with this discrepancy in space by just kind of, giving it a little kind of, I guess, physical aspect where, both, sides are pulling, and what happens is it kind of gets centered, right? And I often, when I first started using constraint layout, thought of this as center positioning, but really it's this idea of, okay, this is a constraint that can't actually like be like literally implemented, but constraint layout has an interesting and consistent and reliable way of resolving that. And it's this kind of behavior that you can manipulate and leverage to do interesting things. So in regards to like the space that is on either side of that constraint, what you can do is actually add some bias to it. Not bad bias, but okay bias. So bias is basically how the discrepancy in space gets distributed between the start and end of the center, or top and bottom if you're doing a vertical center. And basically it basically says, okay, how much of the, you know, difference in space is going to get shoved to the start if it's a horizontal alignment, or how much of it is going to be at the top if it's a vertical alignment. So here, if I set it to 0, it's the icon is shoved all the way to the left. If I set it to 1, all of the space is at the front, so the icon gets shoved to the right. And to be perfectly honest, I don't use this too often in the way that it's being used here, where I'm kind of adding an offset to something that's already center aligned. But you can, and it's something interesting. But what I think is super, super cool, really, is that, there's this concept of, impossible constraints. And the hard part, or the fun part, is trying to figure out what you can do with the fact that you can do these weird constraints and that constraint layout doesn't just crash or like kind of yell at you. So if you go to material design guidelines, and, we look at something like this, right? You see this so often where, a fab can be aligned to the edge of another surface like this. I know, like back in the day, if I had to do something like this, I'd probably just write a custom view group, or I would probably, have everything with a very set dimension, have padding or margins to get this button, center aligned. And it would be kind of brutal. It would be, kind of janky. It wouldn't be easy to maintain or understand either. But with constraint layout and the fact that it kind of has the system for, consistently, again, rendering these impossible constraints, I can instead do something like this, where if I take the top of the poster and the top of the icon rather, and align both it and its bottom to the bottom of the poster. Oops, sorry, that's end. There we go, bottom. It's a little hard to see, but what I have here is now this icon aligned to the edge of this poster, just like, well, if it was a fab, it would be great. But as you can see here, relying on the fact that, again, there's very consistent behavior, the way that constraint layout handles these discrepancies is very consistent, and, kind of relying on that kind of idea of pushing and pulling, and between these constraints, we can do something like this, and we don't have to write custom view groups, and we can, this is much more easy to maintain and easy kind of, once you get the idea that this is something that you can do, is a trick that you can pull out. And total props to Mark Allison for this, because I feel like this is the first like cute trick, or the first thing that really made me feel like, hey, constraint layout is kind of neat. And I don't have to always say, all right, here I go again, creating another custom view group because I have this weird thing I need to do. I can just leverage constraint layout. And again, this is the challenging part, figuring out that you can do stuff like this. But it's something that, once you learn, you can put in your pocket and pull out, because, hopefully, with material design guidelines, or with, if depending on, how, your design at your, work works, you have these kind of, repeated, patterns everywhere. And once you figure out a trick to get what you want, getting something looking and behaving the way you want, you can use that trick over and over again, and it becomes part of your personal toolbox. So I'm not going to put bias yet in the toolbox, but we'll go ahead and go back and put in, let's say impossible constraints. So I'll go back in later, but let's talk about flexibility and scalability. So something that is so important with, doing layouts, and I feel like it's still kind of left over. I remember when I first started programming, I think it was all about like fluid and responsive web pages. So everything was like, in EMs, and everything had to be like, regardless of how big the page was, things have to kind of, shrink and grow. And I feel like that really hits Android development when I first started, kind of hit that button with me, like, oh yeah, isn't it cool about Android? We have to think about, how things like change and how to be like responsive. And, this happens a lot, especially, your mileage again might vary depending on what kind of app you work on, but sometimes, data can be your friend or not be your friend. So down here, I have this fine print. It's a little bit of a weird fine print, and I have this icon. So very, very often, I know at my work, I've done something like this where I have some text and I want this icon, aligned next to it. And I want certain things. I want this fine print to, always stay, inside the left side of my, if it's parent. I want this eye icon to always stay within the right side of the parent, but I also want the eye icon to stick, to stick really closely to the end of that text. And this is what I end up with when I kind of try to satisfy those kind of theoretical constraints with constraint layout. Now, if you use constraint layout for a bit, you might recognize that this has actually become a chain. And, it kind of came this way, like I try to, so the fine print here is actually constrained on the right side to the left of the eye, which at first seems kind of weird. But if I don't do that, then what happens is because the eye here, because again, impossible constraints, it's constrained both on the left and the right, and there's a discrepancy in the actual space it has and the actual space it takes up, it gets centered, right? So in order to fix that and to make sure that things are hugging, I added in that other constraint on my fine print. So I have a chain, and we'll talk more about chains later, but I basically have a big center constraint, right? And 80 to 90% of the time when I pull out bias, it's for this kind of situation where I have two things, I have a very specific way I want them to line up, and they end up being centered. And what I really want is for something like this, where I want to left align it. And I think that's just really funny, right? Because if you think about the name of the attribute, horizontal bias, it doesn't say, it's not literally left align this thing, but kind of, again, understanding how constraint layout works and how you can kind of manipulate things, and the fact that, there's often like leftover space and you can tell constraint layout exactly what you want to do with it. I can do things like this where, okay, the eye is still hugging closely to the text is perfectly left aligned. The right is constrained so that it doesn't kind of shoot out kind of off into the distance on the right side of the parent, and everything's great, and I still have it left aligned. And that's kind of the thing that I think needs to go in the toolbox, is that, there's not a lot of straight answers sometimes with constraint layout, and that's like the problem. But if you kind of know how to use all these tools in conjunction, you can do certain things. And like now I kind of just do this on instinct. And again, it's just something that is a pattern that you learn how to do. And that as, again, you kind of do the same thing or you run into the same situations in your layout, it's just something you pull out of the toolbox. So again, horizontal bias, not just for kind of offsetting your center constraints, but also just for literally left or right aligning things, which is really cool, I think. Now, what's not so cool is, again, like this sense of like content. So here my fine print is really small, right? What if my fine print was super, super long? Oh dear. Okay, so I went to this whole rigmarole about how I wanted to make sure that the eye icon didn't go off all the way kind of off into non-existent space to the right, and here it is doing that. What is going on? So what's going on is wrap content. So very much like match parent being extremely, extremely literal, wrap content is also extremely literal. It will be the width of the content. I believe if you look at the documentation, this was a behavioral change in 1.1. Now, okay, this kind of sucks, right? I really want it to wrap content, but I also want it to be, I want it to fit, right? So, all right, what if I change it back to 0 dp? Okay, that looks good, right? So the icon is still the icon. Oh, I just noticed that, it's an icon. The icon is still hugging to the fine print, and the fine print is within bounds, so things hanging out everywhere. But the problem is that by using match constraint, what happens is if, say, this particular content was short, all right, now I have a problem because my icon is no longer hugging, the content, that text content, because I've made it match constraint. Can I have my cake and eat it too? Yes. And this was my favorite attribute. Like when I discovered this attribute, I swear, like if you could kiss documentation, I guess you can kiss your screen, I would have done this. So if you want to wrap content, but still ultimately have that view still respect constraints, there's an attribute called constrained width, and you set it to true. And what happens is that, again, wrap content is very literal to the point where it will kind of start breaking other constraints that you put on it. When you say constrained width, you're saying, okay, wrap content all you want, but if you get to the point where you're violating constraints on that axis, we're gonna go ahead and prioritize the constraint matching over the wrap contenting. And to show you what this looks like, I'm going to go ahead and I'm sticking the long content. You see, okay, cool. So because this content's extra long and would have kind of, violated constraints and made everything kind of shove off to the right side of the parent view, constrained with actually, again, kind of at the extremes of, the possible sizing will constrain that wrap content. So that absolutely, and I haven't really been throwing things in the toolbox, forgive me, but sorry, so we have horizontal bias, the bias goes in there, and then also constrained width and constrained height. Yeah, so constrained width and constrained height, because especially if you work on, apps where the content's very dynamic, maybe it's user-generated content, maybe again, you're just kind of serving a database of something somewhere, and, the content that you show can vary very widely. It's important to kind of have these kind of tools in your toolbox that can help you, handle those edge cases. And I know I don't always handle edge cases. Half the time my QA guy comes in and says, hey, when, there's a 5,000 character description, this thing happens. And these are the tools that can help you handle those situations. Another one of those really great tools, though, that helps you with this kind of problem of content and sometimes not knowing, exactly, or being able to control exactly, the size and shape of your content is barriers. So if I look at my fine print here, you can see from this constraint that the top of that fine print is constrained to the bottom of this synopsis text blob. Now, again, this looks totally fine as it is, but say my synopsis, which is up here, say that the content of it was actually fairly brief. Okay, now we have a problem because of that constraint, the direct constraining of the top of my fine print to the bottom of that synopsis. Depending on the size of, again, that view, now of that image view rather, I've got my fine print overlapping my image view. Okay, now the 3 a.m. I'm really tired and I just want to go to bed way of solving this, and hopefully they won't, change the content, is to, instead of constraining, the fine print to the synopsis, would be to constrain it to the bottom of the image, which works until, of course, until you get some different data, and that obviously that's not a sustainable, maintainable solution. So what is the solution here? The solution here is barriers. Barriers, I have a lot of favorite things in ConstraintLayout. Barriers is definitely one of them, and I think is something that absolutely 120% needs to be in your toolbox, because it, again, is part of creating flexible, maintainable, and not brittle, layouts. So a barrier is, actually I have a live template for this. So a barrier very technically is a view class, but it's what's termed a virtual helper, and you can read more about them in the documentation. But they're a virtual helper in that they are a view, but really all they're there for is to not be rendered, but to act as targets, or to act as kind of ways of specifying behavior, positioning, sizing of other views. And they're just there to facilitate. And what's really cool about barriers is what you do is you specify a direction. In this case, we'll do bottom. And you specify this group of referenced IDs. So here I'll add in my synopsis and my still. And what this barrier is saying is, okay, in the direction of the barrier, in this case, the bottom, of the views that are in my group of reference IDs, whichever one sticks out the farthest in that direction, I'm going to use that view's, I'm going to use that view as the position of the barrier. So I'm going to align the fine print to the bottom of not either of these views, but rather to this barrier, which you can kind of see here as this dotted line. Now, if I align my fine print to my barrier and then go back to my still and my synopsis, so what's happening is whichever of the synopsis or my still is, sticking out further to the bottom, that becomes the position of my barrier. So if my synopsis is really short, rather than the synopsis dictating the position of the barrier, then the image does, and back and forth. And I just think this is, again, so valuable. It can be horizontal, it can be vertical. And again, I know that I have written custom view groups specifically to solve this kind of problem where I measure one thing, I measure the other thing, and max of this and set the position. You don't have to do that anymore. And I think what's also beneficial about this, especially looking at, using the visual editor, which I know a lot of us don't like doing. I used to be a total visual editor hater. But what's really great about tools like this, about these virtual helpers, about these different features in constraint layout, is that rather than just everything being, you know, magic in XML or magic in code, you can now kind of see, you know, how things are aligned. Someone can come and look at this and say, okay, I see you've got this barrier that, you know, is kind of a grouping of these two things, and you have this other view that's, again, going to respond to that content, the height, whatever that is. And it's a much more easily visible way of being able to discern relationships between views, which I love. Speaking of, actually, let me throw that in before I forget. I'm gonna keep reading my poor toolbox. It's gonna be all empty. But so we have, what did I call it? Barriers, right? They're barriers. I didn't call it that. Nicola and John called it that. So another thing which I think is really cool and is in this kind of vein of, you know, high level, like flexible ways of specifying behavior are guidelines. And hopefully you've used guidelines. And I think they make a lot of sense, especially now with material design, you know, and hopefully, you know, you're working with these, you know, this cool like design system, and you're thinking about layout in terms of like grids or key lines. And what's really neat is that you can actually kind of express these higher level design concepts in code, which I feel like, you know, is very ideal, right? You kind of want, you know, this, you want, again, these layouts to be readable, to be understandable, and to have, you know, connection to the actual thing that gets rendered. So if I look up here, my poster view, right? It has a margin start of 48 dp, that's fine. If I go down here, the title has 48 dp margin start. And if I go down, like more things have the same margin. This is not very maintainable, right? I mean, it's okay because it's just as margin start, but it's not, what if I want to change it, right? If I have 5 things set to the same margin because I want them all kind of along the same line, that's 6, 7, 8 more things that I have to change. And what if, you know, someone's working on something and they don't notice that, you know, you start possibly getting bugs in your layout. What would be nicer, of course, is say I just distracted a dimension resource and have like a common, you know, dimension resource, and then to reuse that in all the margins. But what I think is an even nicer way of doing this is to use guidelines. So a guideline is another one of those virtual helpers. It is very literally a view, but it doesn't get rendered. And they can be vertical or horizontal. And they can be positioned either as some offset from kind of like the ends of that axis, or as a percentage along that axis. In this case, I'll say I want a guideline that is offset from the beginning of my parent from the left side, and I want it to be offset that 48 dp. Now, rather than kind of saying, okay, the margin on this view is 48 dp, what I can do instead is, rather than aligning it to the start parent, I can instead say, okay, constraint start to start keyline, and let me just add in an end keyline just for symmetry, and then do add ID and keyline. Okay, oops, because that's tops. There we go. Haha. Live coding is fun. Oh, what did I do? Oh, and keyline end. There we go. There we go. Oops. And then add in my horizontal bias. There, something like that. I didn't actually have to constrain that to the end. But as you can see here, what's neat is that rather than saying, actually, let me get rid of that. Rather than saying, okay, this has the same margin as this, has the same margin as this, I have a kind of high level specification of this, positioning. And what's neat is that if you are using kind of like grids and such as a design system in your work on your teams, you can go ahead and kind of mirror, the kind of design concepts, your grids inside of your actual layouts. And what's neat is that, as you change, rather than changing, individual margins, you can just change this key line, and whatever is attached to it will go with it, which I think is just really cool. And again, from the standpoint of visualizing and grokking and trying to understand what a layout is doing, kind of just looking at it rather than having to parse the code, I can look at the visual editor and say, hey, there's a key line here. And, eventually all of these views that sit on this 48 dp for now keyline are all connected to this guideline, which I think is really neat. So let's throw in guidelines into our toolbox. So let's keep talking about virtual helpers. There are so many, and they are really handy for kind of, again, doing these things which are seemingly simple and are, probably problems that you solved 100,000 times with not a terrible amount of sweat, but that can be done way better in constraint layout using these like simple tools. So at the bottom here, I have these 3 buttons. Now let's just say that, I have portions of my UI that need to get toggled off or on depending on data, depending on user permissions, whatever, that happens all the time. And I know I've probably done this thousands of times by now, but I'll go into, my activity class and, find view by ID or butter knife or whatever, or view binding now these days, and go to each one, maybe in a loop, maybe not, and say, okay, is visible equals false, is visible equals false, yada, yada, yada. I don't have to do that. And in fact, I can actually, in my XML, declare that, hey, these 3 buttons have to have a certain behavior that they share. And in terms of being able to say, toggle the visibility of a group of views or change the elevation of a group of views, I have group. So yet another virtual helper. And what group does is, it's not that easy to tell from the name, but it allows you to coordinate the visibility, gone, invisible, visible, or the elevation of whatever views you specify in the reference IDs. So if I specify my 3 buttons down here, and if I set visibility gone on this group, all 3 of them disappear. And of course, if they want to come back, if I want them to come back, they come back. And you can leverage this in code as well. You can pull, because of the fact that it is underneath the hood of view, you can call find by ID or butter knife or view binding and do whatever kind of more dynamic type logic on this group and treat it like a single view, but in reality coordinate the visibility or elevation of these as a group. And again, I think this is great for a number of reasons. It's a little bit drier, but I also, again, going back to this idea of making your layout super understandable and maintainable, rather than, if I added another button here, rather than having to make sure that in all the places where I toggle buttons off and on that I add it, I can just add it to this group and it gets kind of included in whatever logic, is applied to the group. And from a visual standpoint, I can see, looking at this file, okay, there's some shared behavior in this group of buttons and some shared behavior in this other group of buttons. And groups are actually able to overlap. You could have, groups don't have to be like mutually exclusive groups of IDs. So again, a really simple tool and a really common problem, right? It's like toggling visibility on multiple views, but something that I think ConstraintLayout is really awesome for and is a great tool and absolutely goes in your toolbox, because I mean, how many times have all of us done that in our day-to-day layout building lives? So I want to go back and talk about chains. So I love ConstraintLayout so much, so I've given a few talks on it. And one of my spiels, I prefer distinctly talking about ConstraintLayout and saying, well, if you want some linear layout in your ConstraintLayout, you should use chains. I'm going to walk back that statement quite a bit. And after like 4 years or so of working with ConstraintLayout, working with other folks' constraint layouts, I want to say not so much. So a chain, if you're not familiar, is basically is like, it is a linear kind of layout, a linear space layout of views in your constraint layout. And it really is like a doubly linked list of views, because each view in a chain is bidirectionally connected. So for example, in this chain, this is a chain of knife icons. The first icon is constrained to the parent and the second icon, the second to the first and the third, and then so on and so on. So everything is connected on both sides. And what's really cool about chains is that it's playing in, again, to that centering, that impossible constraint, resolution that ConstraintLayout has. And chains allow you not just to position, views in a line, but also to control the spacing in between. So with a chain, you can do cool stuff like, there's different chain styles. So if I want to kind of evenly spread out the space in between and on the outside of chains, minus the margins, I can use spread. If I don't want any extra space on the outside of the chain, I can use spread inside. And if I want to kind of basically treat every view in my chain as a single view and move stuff around with bias and being able to kind of shove that whole group to the left or the right, I can do that with chains, and it's really cool. If you don't need all this, if you're literally just trying to put one view after the other, well, for one, if you're just doing like a linear layout, just do a linear layout. Really, it's totally fine. No, I feel like using constraint layout well is a part of that is knowing when not to use it. But you can easily, if I just didn't care about the spacing, I could literally just do single connections between each knife. It doesn't matter. What I think chains are good for is, again, is controlling the spacing, or say you wanted to do something like this, where I wanted them more or less center aligned, but I wanted to do something cute like this, where they're packed, but there's still kind of a margin in between. So they're centered, but they have some space in the middle. That's what chains are good for. If you don't need that, just either simply connect one to the left of the other, one to the right of the other, and so on and so forth, or use a linear layout if that's all you're doing and not doing anything else relative. Now, okay, so I still think chains are super useful, but I think the tool here, or the takeaway, is to know when to use them. And there's been so many times where I've done a layout and I've messed up the chain. Like I've broken one of the double like connections here, or there was a view in the chain that was actually not actually adjacent to other tags, like it was somewhere else, and it just becomes a maintenance nightmare. So that's why I kind of caution it, and I would totally walk back my statement that chains are linear layout and constraint layout. But I'm going to follow that up with saying, if you like Flexbox, then there's Flexbox and constraint layout. And I'm going to replace this chain of icons with a bunch of icons. They're not constrained, so they're all up in here. But a really cool tool in constraint layout is flow. So I'm going to try to hurry up and finish this up because flows are awesome and I want to show y'all. Here it is. Nice. So a flow is yet another virtual helper. And okay, for brevity, I'm just going to do that. So what's really interesting is, and if I change this, so flows again are a virtual grouping of views. And what's really interesting is that, you know, you have a mode, you are able to constrain the flow as if it was a barrier or something. And then you have this group of reference IDs. Now, the order in which you specify those IDs is the order in which these views get, you know, linearly laid out, either vertically or horizontally. And what's really cool is that as it's laying out these views in a line, if there is a view that, if laid out, would violate the constraints, then flow will just start another row or another column, depending on what direction it goes in. And yeah, it's like Flexbox. And what's really cool is that there's different modes as well. Right now, this is in aligned, but there's also chain, where it basically kind of takes each row in this flow and then creates chains out of it. So you get that cool behavior, and you can actually kind of go in and specify the behavior of each chain. Aligned, which I have, is really cool. It's hard to tell from here because all the knives are equally sized, but if I say change this, the size of this view to be, let's do something really big. What aligned is doing is actually creating columns, like aligned columns. So you can kind of see here, this view is super wide, this one isn't, but flow is actually trying to align corresponding views in like the different rows. And I think this is really cool. I actually, 2 years ago for Trello, implemented like Slack style reactions on comments. And I really wanted this behavior. Flexbox didn't work out. And I ended up writing my own custom view group to do this. But if we had been able to use 1.1 at a time, I could have just easily done this flow. And as you can see here, again, just going back to the same themes of, you know, being able to be responsive, especially if you have really dynamic content, like if these like icons were kind of dependent on some kind of dynamic data or something, or just dynamically generated, you can kind of see how this helps, again, make your layout flexible and scalable. And also, you know, because everything, rather than having a custom view group with some arcane logic, I have just a single tag that is able to describe what is going on here. So I hope that was helpful, and that either you learned about some tools that you didn't know about before, or that, you know, you're excited by kind of like the very, you know, I think fairly a small handful of tools that you can use that once you kind of get them more straightforward, and that can really help you. Again, like they help me 80 to 90% of the time with my constraint layout building. I can do most things I ever need to do, even like accounting for crazy data or, you know, weird positioning with these tools. And, you know, if you're overwhelmed with constraint layout, I hope that you look at these things and try to get comfortable with them, and yeah, start feeling less overwhelmed by it, and start really kind of building your own toolbox of interesting patterns and, you know, techniques to use with constraint layout. And that's my talk. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Okay, I have turned off the mute feature so everyone can unmute themselves and ask questions. There are also some questions already in the Zoom chat.
Oh, sorry. Ooh, sorry. Trying to find questions. Ooh, ooh. Da, 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 da. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna go bottom up. I apologize, or maybe hold on. I will share the Dropbox link, by the way. I'll post it in the Slack channel. I have like the totally finished one, and there's also links to all the pages that I reference and also all the items that we talked about today. Let's see. With the baseline and having multiple lines, would you have options to align like top center, like top line, first line, bottom line, center line, middle? I'm assuming you're meaning like multiple lines of text. Is that right? I wasn't quite sure. Sorry, who was that asked that question? Is that William? William?
Yes. Hi. Hello.
Hi. Sorry. Hi.
Yeah. If when you have like you are aligning another view with a baseline of the text view,
Mm-hmm.
and this text view has multiple lines, how the based align view will behave? Will it be in the top, in the middle, or in the bottom?
That's a really good question. I've actually never tried that. My gut reaction, and is Nicola or John here?
That is going to be like the first line.
Cool. This is like cheating. I have Nicola and John in the chat, so it's just like cheating. Sorry. Let's see. When do you use barriers versus guidelines? So personally for me, I generally like guidelines for things like, say, in like a form view, like when I have like multiple text fields and I just want all those text fields aligned along like, you know, some DP on the left. I use like for there. For barriers, very often I'll use that within the actual kind of content. So a lot of times, especially for like the example I gave you where it was like an image and like some text, and you know they could be like multiple, like whenever I want, say, whenever I have like the actual content that is very variable, and I have like text, like I have content below that, right? So I have some content that's very variable, and then I have some content that sits even below that or to the right of that or whatever. I think the name of it is actually very appropriate because at some point you want, you know, a barrier, a wall where everything else needs to be. So I don't know if that makes much sense, but it's very kind of like, I'll just say, okay, barriers are for very dynamic stuff, and guidelines for me is when I'm very establishing, like, again, key lines and grids that, you know, very consistent and specific, like places where things should be in the layout. Sorry, but I feel like I need a whiteboarding when I like draw like the answers to the questions. Sorry, do we still have time for, I know we're getting close to the last session. If there's any questions that you want, just throw them in Slack. And I will try to answer them as best we can, or we're just gonna bother John and Nicola. Let's see, any other questions? Yeah, just post them in Slack. I don't wanna keep anyone from the next talk, but yeah, thank you all so much for coming, and I hope that was helpful. And yeah, I'll just see y'all in Slack. How's that? Cool, okay.
Awesome talk, thank you.
Thank you for coming.